So I think it's forecast to be 23 degrees outside this afternoon, and we've just had the hottest September ever, and much of southern Europe has been on fire for quite a lot of the summer, and the other half has been flooded, and those are just impacts within Europe, and most of the major impacts we know are happening in the global south. So this is quite a good time to be talking about how we do everything we do in more sustainable ways. And just to give a little bit of urgency to it, I first learnt about climate as an architect, which is my background trade, if you like, in 1992. And that's more than 30 years ago. And everything we learnt about then has happened. So this is really not something that we need to think about now, because one of these days we need to do something about it. We need to do it really urgently, really quickly, and now. And that's why it's so great to see so many of you here, and why we can start with good news, which is that although almost everything to do with climate is really depressing, in culture and the arts, we do have solutions, and we are making traction, and there are solutions to everything we need to do to make sure that we can all work, whatever our work is, within the parameters that the climate emergency has set us. And that's very much takes us back to how the Green Book initiative, the Theatre Green Book, started to take shape. We were in COVID. We'd all just learnt more or less how to use Zoom. And a group of us got together from within theatre. And every time I say theatre, I mean theatre in the absolute broadest sense. It's never been just about stuff that happens on stages in traditional theatre buildings. We've had people who work outdoors, people who work in fields, everybody involved in this initiative. We got a group of us together and said, hang on, we've been talking in the arts about sustainability for 10, 15 years. Julie's Bicycle, who you all know, are good partners of ours, have been running for 15 years. We all know the climate emergency is happening. So why is it that we're not really changing? What's the hold up? And in a series of Zooms with everybody locked down, none of us was able to make work. We just started tackling that, saying, okay, what are the blockers? How do we need to be tackling this differently if we want to make theatre sustainable? Since then, just at the end of 21 that we brought out the last bit of the Green Book in the UK, things have moved incredibly fast to the point at which on last Friday afternoon, we were in the European Commission in Brussels, who've just adopted the Green Book as a pathway to net zero for European theatre. And our aim is to try and reach net zero by 2030, and that is achievable. There's one problem with it, but otherwise it is realistic and achievable. And whatever sector you're working on, it's possible to do that. And I really hope that all of you, many of you are probably doing a lot of this already, but all of you will join with that now. We've already got to a point, I think we're in 12 translations. This is not us selling. We're not a commercial organisation. This is people from around the world coming to us and saying, this looks like it works. Can we translate it? And we say, start your own network. Yes, we can all make this work, because it's through networks, including the network that's in this room, that we learn. There is no point in every theatre, gaming organisation, whatever, writing their own rules. It's not rocket science being sustainable. There are things that are hard. There are things you need to think differently. There are things you need to work differently. But fundamentally, we're trying to use less energy and less resource. It's not that we know how to do it. So for everyone to write their own rules, start from scratch, go back to first principles, we're way past that. We've got solutions and they're ready for everybody to use. There are going to be things in immersive, or certainly in some of the areas of immersive, that we haven't covered and we haven't talked about yet. We know that. And that's the way the Green Book has grown as an initiative, not top down. I didn't write it myself. It's been created by theatre makers of all sorts. Again, I'm using that term really broadly. And where there are areas, art forms, practices that we haven't covered, that's when we need you to jump in and say, look, we can help with this. We can write a toolkit for this. We think if this isn't going to work for us because we have different practices, so let's talk about how we can make it work. And that's the way we've spread across Europe, across the world. And just underlining that point about partnership, this is completely a partnership, and everybody in UK theatre, very many in European theatre, and further afield as well, are getting together so that we can work on this together. And that's really the first thing we've learned about change that's going to be real. We can all solve the climate emergency on paper. That's easy. Solving it in the real world is the challenge, and that's what we're trying to do. The first thing we learned about is that guidance standards need to be collective. The second is that they need to be practical. I'm going to hazard a guess. We may have some good boffin brains in the room, but for most of us, me included, to say to you, you need to cut your carbon emissions by 10% a year means absolutely zero. I would have no idea what that would mean in detail for me. And as we've talked to people across theatre, designers, producers, production managers, actors, writers, people who run buildings, people who run marketing campaigns, that's what they do. We don't do carbon. So what we've needed to do is go deep down into the system and say, okay, what are the decisions that you can control, that are up to you, and that you could make differently? And what is it that you can only do differently if your producer sets up the show in a different way, or if somebody else works in a different way? I'll give you an example of a designer saying, I'm passionate about this, I live in a sustainable way, or try to at home. I want my designs to be made sustainably, but I'm not specifying where the plywood comes from. That's somebody else's decision. So that's just an example of how we needed to look at the whole chain of decision-making that goes into shows. And a lot of it will overlap with everything you do, and there'll be some bits that we haven't looked at from your worlds, so that by putting together the expertise of yourselves, the people like the people in this room, and bringing it together with sustainability expertise, and everything we did, we had our sustainability engineering partners, Bira Happel, fantastic engineering firm, in the room, so that we could be sure that everything that we took away as standards, as guidance, was realistic because it came from you, and was going to have genuine impact because it came from sustainability experts. The third thing we realised is that guidance has to be methodical. Time and again, talking to theatres and other organisations, we just get a kind of, I don't know where to start. So we are no longer printing our programmes, and we've got a good policy for reusable cups in the bar, or something. You know, we all know some examples of that. But of course, if we want to have impact across everything we do, we need to be really methodical. So we've divided the challenge into 3, and if you go on the website, theatregreenbook.com, you'll find all 3 volumes completely free to use for everyone to download. And we know that the work we make, productions in theatre parlance, but if you're working in gaming or something, it'll be a particular show, a particular event, whatever the language you use is, but the work we make, and we need to make it sustainably. Anyone who has a building, it might be a theatre building, it might be somewhere you rent, it might just be your office. Anyone who controls a building, we need to make the building sustainable, because that's usually one of the biggest impacts. And then everything else that we do, marketing, box office, catering, if you control catering, waste, travel, transport, deliveries, all of that stuff, our operations, let's call it, we need to do that sustainably as well. So we've got 3 volumes, productions, buildings, and operations. And I'm going to zip, they're all available online for free. And I'm going to zip through what the principles are behind each of them as quickly as I can. And with productions, we know through our engineering partners that the big impact is the stuff that goes on stage, or the stuff that goes into an immersive show. Where does it come from, and what happens to it afterwards? Sets, props, costumes, where's it from? And what we need to get away from is what theatre has been doing for 50 years because we didn't see the consequences, which is taking raw materials from nature, plywood from rainforests, and the majority of timber that comes into this country is not sustainable. Steel, aluminium, huge users of energy to make them. Taking raw materials, putting them into shows for our entertainment, and then putting them into landfill. And that still happens. And it has happened even more over the last 20, 30 years. We need to move to a circular economy for culture. We need to reuse and recycle. And becoming sustainable is all about that. And that's a systems change. It involves producers giving us more time. It involves designers thinking differently. It involves people who are into procurement and making, working in different ways. And it is completely possible. Every show that the National Theatre in London makes, every show that National Theatre in Scotland makes, every show that National Theatre Wales makes is made to Green Book standards at baseline, which is the lowest standard, which means that half of everything that you see on a stage in a National Theatre show, big shows, is reused or recycled, and more than half will be reused and recycled afterwards. And as you cycle up through the levels of the Green Book, we'll make that harder and harder until you get to net zero. How you do it is by working collaboratively, looking at the chains of decision making. One person can't do this by yourselves. If any of you is a designer, you can't just go on thinking the way you always did, give it to a production manager and say, please, can you make this green? It doesn't work like that. It's got to be flexible. It's got to be collaborative. If you're doing something visually complex, and there's nothing wrong with that, if the show needs it, we need to learn how to do it. Then you're going to need the expertise of the whole team to achieve it in a sustainable way. And by working as a team, we know that you can make large, complex, visually rich shows in sustainable ways. But it's everyone's job. It doesn't belong to anyone. And in the Green Book, you'll find notes on what is the creative challenge for conceivers, writers, directors, designers. What's the producing challenge? We've learned it doesn't need to cost more to work sustainably, but if you leave it to the last minute, it will cost more, because sustainable new materials cost more than old ones. But if you're planning, if you're giving more time, then you can do it cost neutral. How to make, how to dispose, the technical challenge, which is much smaller because most technical equipment is hired, but it's there as well, to arrive at a wheel which is a model for making work in a circular, sustainable way. And we go through principles. What's the decision making which takes us to green outcomes? Do I need this item? If I do, that's fine. It's not wrong to make things which are complex, but just ask the question first. If I know that I need a staircase in this show, have we got one off an old show or that we can borrow from someone else we know? Okay, if we can't, but we're still sure we need it, then can we make one out of salvage materials? And if we can't, but you're still really, really sure you need it, then at least can we use certified materials that we know aren't going to damage the planet? And at the bottom of that chain is, if you know that the only way to have something in your show is to make it in a way which is going to damage the planet, and you're absolutely certain it's worth doing, then go ahead. You can still reach Green Book baseline. We're only looking for 50% of reused and recycled. You wouldn't be able to make an advanced, a net zero show that way, but we know that the world is not engineered for sustainability, that it can be hard to find green materials. We know that, and that's why we've set this as a series of steps to help us all take the steps eventually to net zero. And the guidance sets out how you get from baseline to intermediate to advanced. Those are the standards, the fundamental standards we're working to. Most of what's in sustainable productions will apply to most of the shows that you make, not all, but the overlap is going to be very big. We created the Green Book, the Theatre Green Book, to be very broad for outdoor shows, site-specific shows, touring shows, and also for big opera and whatever. It's very broad, and the principles are exactly the same. And where, as I say, there are gaps, then let's work together to fill them in. Buildings, most of you, I'm guessing, don't control a big theatre building, like the Opera House or the Lyric Hammersmith or whatever. Hands up anybody who does actually have control of a building. Because if there's nobody, I'm going to go through this super fast. Because the main point of this is just to stress, and the Arts Green Book, incidentally, is something we've created on from the Theatre Green Book to cover all other arts fields, cinema, rock and pop, classical music, dance, whatever, just covering their buildings. The main point of this for you, and this is all about how to make a building sustainable, and we know how to do that. We've been doing it for years. We just don't have enough money. But we know the solutions and what you need to do in what order to make it sustainable. The main relevance of that for you is that it's not just down to you. Everything else in theatre needs to be working in the same direction. And finally, sustainable operations, which is going to cover a lot of what you do. Marketing, how does your audience come to your shows if you're doing physical shows? And what can you do to try and reduce those impacts? You can't tell them they can only come if they cycle, but you can offer incentives. Or you can say, make sure that on your website you're including public transport links and things like that. We put all of that into the Green Book. There are ways to tackle some of these things. And of course, standards front of house for how you manage your websites. Do you print programs? If so, how many? Because remember, this isn't about being perfect tomorrow. It's about reducing and getting ourselves on the journey. Digital strategy, marketing strategy, retail, back of house, about staff travel, about visitor travel, about how you manage rehearsals. You can get baffled by this because there's so much stuff. So we've tried to put it in really logical orders so everything is there that you might need to do, and you can find your way to it and start making progress. So what's the way? What's your waste policy? You don't have to invent it from scratch. Everybody's doing this, and you can find ways to get the guidance that'll take you to waste and travel and transportation policies that will take you forward through baseline and intermediate to advanced. Again, we've looked at each of those areas and set standards for them so that you can benchmark your own progress. You don't have to get into carbon calculation, which is a complete mare and wasp's nest, which has driven all of us crazy for the last 20 years. We don't need to do that, honestly, because what we're looking at is what are we doing differently, and how do we do it differently and still go on making great work, which is, of course, what everybody is here for. And so together, the Theatre Green Book and the Arts Green Book will give you a complete framework for how you plan your journey to net zero, which is a journey that none of us has any choice about. It'll give you guidance and it will set standards. So let's have a conversation. Let's have some questions.
One of the things I think that's quite distinct about the way that immersive work is made is it's often made in meanwhile or pop-up or DIY spaces that we have either control over a very short period of time, or very little control over. What have you come across kind of that approach, and what's kind of like the biggest challenges of working in that kind of meanwhile?
Yeah, and I think I'd phrase a really, really important question, a good question. And I'd frame it by saying one of the things about sustainability, there are, sort of, to me, two things always to keep in your mind about sustainability. One is it's not about being perfect straight away. People often in talking about sustainability go straight to, everything has got to be perfect. It's going to take time to get there. It's about improvement. If you can get halfway, then you really have got halfway. And the other is don't get lost in the woods of stuff you can't control. If you're in a meanwhile use, you are not about to turn it into a perfectly sustainable building. You don't have the money. You don't have the rights. It's somebody else's job to do that. So stop worrying about it. Having said that, there may be, then in that case, focus on the work itself, focus on how you're marketing it, focus on the stuff you can control. That's the basic answer. Having said that, there are ways in which you might, in some cases, see opportunities to move forward. You can put some pressure on landlords, partners who are developers who are going into contracts with you to say, what are your plans for this building? And by the way, do you know about the Green Book, which will help you to make the building sustainable? In other words, use your lobbying power. So you can do that. And the other thing that crosses my mind is a fantastic project which took place at Battersea Arts Centre after the fire there. And they did a refurb, and in fact leading up to the fire as well, they did a refurb where they didn't have sort of lots of capital money, but they were doing projects in the building and shows around the building. And whenever they did one, they said, well, is there something we can do here to make it more sustainable? While we're fitting out this kind of leaky roofed, unused room because we want to do part of an immersive show there, could we actually fix the roof and insulate the roof? And working piecemeal in that way, it won't apply that often perhaps, but there may be ways as you look at buildings which you occupy that you can just say, okay, is there anything we can win here to make the building more sustainable?
And I think that part of it, that again, at the heart of what we do is that recycling and reuse because it's so pop-up, because it's so DIY, and because we're utilising spaces that would otherwise be sat unused as well. So just a little side note, you will be asked to do surveys and feedback and stuff for us after the end of the day, because that's what we always do, because how you feel and what you think is really important to IEN. And I wonder if there's the possibility or the momentum for maybe some kind of swap shop or a place where we can, exactly when we were talking about the staircase, I wonder if there's a way we can share and pool resource, especially knowing that a lot of the kind of work we make utilises antiques or vintage or kind of like older objects. So that's just something I wanted to sort of put in everyone's mind. And
that's a really good point to make, because I'm really hoping that in what I was saying, that wasn't sort of sounding as if none of you are doing anything. I know loads of you are doing stuff, either because you're committed to changing your practice or because your work is innately sustainable. You know, many of you might look at the Green Book standards and think, well, hang on, should we do this? That's great. That's fantastic. And even beyond that, the other thing we were aware of right from the start of making the Green Book is that we're learning the whole time. This is not top down, it's bottom up. So where you've got expertise in sourcing shows sustainably, and you know about networks and sources, please bring them in. And if you think that we can strengthen the guidance we've got on procurement, for example, procurement of props, procurement of whatever it might be, there may be loads in this sector that we can learn from and strengthen, that, and then pass on to people working in more traditional theatre ways. So this has got to be a shared, a collective, a two-way dialogue if we're all collectively going to make the guidance as good as it can be for everyone.
And so are you open to people potentially reaching out after today if they have that to offer, if
Massively.
they have contribution? And what's the best way for them to access kind of you?
Yeah, there's a and this is happening. We had somebody or a couple of people who got in touch 3 months ago, I think, saying, you know, lots of us are now doing hybrid work, which involves digital and filming, and there's no guidance in the Green Book for that. Can we do a toolkit page that everyone can use? They researched, they talked to lots of other people and brought them in, and that's now up on the website. So yeah, a toolkit page on immersive work, please, you know, that would be so helpful to everyone, and we could put it on the website. To get in touch, you'll find an email on the website. Get in touch, and that will go straight through to Stephanie Thomas, our fantastic coordinator, who will find the right people to talk to and respond, or to work out how we can best bring in your voices to be part of it.
And so just the other question I have, hands up if you are freelance or you're a solo maker. So we have quite a few, and this is a feature of this sector, which is very prevalent, is lots of people are freelance and work across different projects. What that means is they don't have, like you said, a lot of control in those processes. And so I guess I wanted to ask your advice on how do we leverage and advocate while also managing that fear of not being hired or not being used if we're the ones pressing in that way.
It's something we're really aware of. And when we were doing the consultation for the Green Book, we made sure that we were talking to freelancers. I forget the proportion now, but it absolutely was not coming from the theatres. It was a dialogue between freelancers and theatres, because there are key roles in this. Most designers, if not all designers really, are freelancers. A huge number of production managers are freelancers. Those are just two key roles without which sustainability is not going to happen. But equally, we're really aware that, you know, countless designers have said to us, you know, if the director isn't really on board with this, I know it's not going to happen. If the producer is still saying, well, you know, we want to see your white card model by the end of next month, where is my thinking time for this? So you can't do it by yourselves as a freelancer. So I think the key thing is not to beat yourself up if the show isn't set up to enable it to be green. But the key thing I was going to say is to persuade at the outset the producer to set this up. And this is where the Green Book really helps, because instead of having a sort of long conversation about what matters to you, you can just say, and designers and other freelancers are doing this, saying, you know, I worked a Green Book baseline. And the point of the Green Book, the point of why it needed to be collective, is that's becoming something that everybody understands.
Are back to an equity?
Equity, yes. Back to a bit less formally, but lots of people that we speak to are back to members. Equity, we've had good conversations. They've gone a bit quiet actually, but we have had good conversations with them about bringing in actors. There's not much for actors at the moment in the Green Book. We took a decision early on. Partly we were rushing to get it out in COVID. Partly we took a decision of not wanting people to feel responsible when there's nothing they can do. You know, and actors do tend to come in later in the chain. I think we had a really good talk with Equity, who was saying, well, you know, hang on, they need to know what standards the show's been made to. And if we're, for a touring show, for instance, if we're asking actors to travel in a certain way, to stay in certain places, then of course we need their enthusiasm and input and ideas as well, rehearsals, whatever it might be. Of course, that was absolutely right. So we've now got some toolkit pages from Equity about that. And I think we need to do a bit more actually, but that's a sort of ongoing chat.
Well, it's making that, it's because if that becomes a standard, in the same way that you'd be like, I work to Equity minimum,
yeah,
and you say I work to Green Book baseline, if that can become the sector standard,
that's exactly,
and it's easier to leverage, isn't it? It's easier to advocate when you have kind of those bodies behind you supporting that as well. And Beck 2 seems to me to be a key person who needs a key organisation that needs to say, actually, we would really love it if we get to the point where everyone is working from that baseline. And
we need to have sort of standard contract riders coming both ways, both a freelancer saying, you know, look, this is how I expect to work, and also producers saying, this is how the show is going to be made, so that means all of you. If they become standard, and I think we've got a couple of standard forms on the website. If that becomes standard practice, so everybody just says, oh yeah, of course there's a Green Book rider in there. And if you go into a team knowing that everybody's done this before and they know what baseline means, and that's increasingly the case, at least in inverted commas conventional theatre work, and not only in this country, then, you know, this needs to be like health and safety. You know, you're not here to be sustainable, you're here to make great immersive shows, but they need to be sustainable just like they need to be safe. So it needs to become something we don't talk about because it's so familiar.
I agree, and as someone who works, for me, I work at the University of Birmingham in the theatre arts department, and we have a theatre crafts department. Yeah. And as far as I know, we don't have this on our curriculum and our syllabus in that theatre crafts side, which is going to change from today because I'm going to. And we've got a fantastic network, a Green Book network for schools generally and universities, which it will be brilliant to hook you up with. Yes, absolutely. So I would like to open questions now to the floor. So we have a hand down here at the front.
Yeah, this is such a great initiative, and you know, I was just looking through the Green Book towards the end just to like get deeper into the text of it, and I feel like there's an opportunity space here that I'm interested to kind of provoke in this conversation, which is the plays themselves can have sustainable points of view. It's fine and good if we, you know, do the recycling and we make the production itself carbon neutral. But if the play is about topics which reinforce the culture of consuming fossil fuels, for instance, in any way, then we're missing the opportunity to actually have the greatest impact that culture can have, which is affect audiences. So I think that's kind of, for me, it felt like a missing piece. I feel like there's got to be some diplomatic way to create some movement in that space. I feel in the design world, for instance, there's this thing called the First Things First Manifesto, which has been revived, I think, pretty recently as a call towards designers to think as critical designers about various different social issues or environmental issues. So I think it's not outside of, you know, the range of imagination to see a world in which, hey, wait a minute, like, why isn't the content of the play itself something that's trying to envision perhaps a better future that's more livable? And do we really, in this climate emergency, have, you know, a strong ethical stance if we're putting on plays that perhaps are either just head in the sand about climate change or have no opinion whatsoever? I think a critical discourse around the content of the theater is so vital here. So it's a super inspiring initiative. And I was just thinking, but the storytelling too, right?
It's incredibly important. There's work about, I can't imagine that we're going to face the climate challenge without theatre being part, again, theatre in the broadest sense, being part of that conversation. And there is great work, some good shows happening in that way. I was on a Zoom last week. There's an initiative, again, this is a European initiative, Fabula Mundi, which has brought together 19 young writers, and climate is one of the themes of how do we write about climate? Because the truth is, and I say this as somebody who's been active in climate for 30 years, I've seen very, very few good shows about climate. It's incredibly hard to do. But going back to your question of why isn't it in the Green Book, there's something else which isn't in the Green Book. And I think this is quite an interesting sort of illustration of the journey we all went on collectively in making it. We started out thinking, with regard to productions, hang on, this isn't actually that hard. You do a bare stage show, it's green. Peter Brook, Arte Povera, completely green. What's the problem? Why don't we just advocate that? Minimalist stagings. But quite a few artistic directors and directors pushed back, not because they were resistant to the journey we all need to make, but saying there are stories that need to be big, that need to be visually spectacular. So we need to learn how to do that too. And if we treat this just as a fashion, this year we're doing minimal, it's not going to last, and people are then going to push back the other way. And so we got to a point through that of saying, hang on, we really want those conversations to be happening. We would love to see more minimal stagings, etc. But we're not going to say that. The Green Book is there just to say, this is, if you want to make shows sustainably, this is what you need to do. But creatively, it's not our business. It's up to all theatre makers to decide artistically, creatively, ethically, what you want to do. And so, much as I personally really support those conversations, we think it's right that they happen outside the Green Book itself.
I think our superpower in this sector, regardless of the kind of immersive or interactive work that we make, is affect. And I think we have barely tapped the potential for addressing environmental issues, but broad social challenges that we're facing as a culture. And I think our ability to put people in other people's shoes or perspectives and to generate empathy and to generate transformation, which is at the heart of what we do, has the power to address some of these huge challenges and affect people's perceptions and people's behaviours and people's actions. And I think we have barely scratched the potential. I mean, this is my passion. I genuinely believe the transformational qualities of immersive are huge in addressing and being ethical in the way that we approach those things. And in some ways, it's a kind of call to action, not just beyond, like with the practical ways that we can do that, but like you said, also changing hearts and minds, because that's what we have the power to do in immersive. And I think we have barely touched the potential of that. And it excites me that we have all that ahead of us, and we have the possibility to be able to affect behaviours beyond kind of the production itself as well.
Really agree with all of that.
Hi there. I work at Goldsmiths in the Theatre and Performance Department. My name's Alexa Reid. My thought track was on something else at the point where you started to mention a network for schools and potentially universities. And I just wanted to hear more about that, because the reason I chose this session, other than obviously the critical importance of trying to make work that is sustainable as possible, I came for practical reasons, because I'm trying to embed sustainability across our degree programs at Goldsmiths.
Yeah, and this has been in the conversation from the very start of the Green Book. We started talking to schools, knowing that, well, I suppose all sorts of things. There is a generational split in sustainability, which I really understand, and I suppose I'm speaking as an architect now, and knowing that sustainability didn't come into my thinking until a certain point in my career, and that by then my creative processes had already taken a certain shape, and starting to rethink sustainably meant unpicking all of that, whereas students and young practitioners are still devising how they want to think and work. They're much more flexible about, and creative in some ways, about what it means to make in the context of the climate crisis. So they're brilliant parts of this conversation anyway. There are other great things about schools. You make lots of work, and that's lots of opportunity to experiment. You are a laboratory for ideas and thinking and research, and that's exactly what green working needs. And of course, just to get to the sort of practicalities of it, students are going to be coming out into a world which is very rapidly turning green, and they need to know how to do it. You know, the practices of all the big theatre workshops are changing. It's about reuse and recycling. It's about making joints. If you're in a maker, in different ways, so that you can salvage the materials more easily. And of course, students need to learn about that. So it's really important. Schools are part of this.
So we have a real issue at Birmingham. So until this year, we've been keeping, because we reuse and recycle, we had a huge costume store under the stage space, all of that. We had huge amounts of set that we reuse, costumes we reuse. But we have massively come up against failing our inspections on a regular basis. And they are forcing us now to dispose of items that we don't want to, that we want to. And so we are coming up against this. So we've come up with an interim solution, which is the university have given us some shipping containers at the back of our theatre to put bits in. But again, they're very, very limited. And what it means is a considerable more amount of work for our production team, because they are passionate about this. And so that now they're trying to pass it rather than it going in a skip, which is what the uni want us to do for a green institution. This is extraordinary, but these are the challenges that we have. So we have the health and safety fire regulations actually prohibiting us from reusing and recycling in the ways that we'd like to. And so now what we have now is a very good relationship with all of the cultural institutions in Birmingham that we can kind of go, we've got these, we don't want them to go in a skip. Who would like them? And so it's trying to build some of those relationships. And then again, you know, once we give them a whole load of stuff, we can then go and say, we're looking for this. And is there any chance we could borrow this from you?
It's exactly the way forward, is sharing networks. And there is a frustration. I remember somebody, I think it was from the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow, saying, you know, we all in theatre, and I as an architect was part of this, spent the 90s turning our stores into studio spaces, and now we haven't got any stores. And it's very frustrating. There is, and you know, there are places we were doing a tour in some German theatres. They've all got massive stores. They're all doing 30 shows a year and recycling everything. It's just great. We haven't got that here. But there are really good initiatives going. GMAST, who are the organisation for arts and cultural organisations in Greater Manchester, have got an initiative running to try and do a big shared store. The National Theatre and GLA are leading an initiative for a store in London. There's lots of networking in Scottish theatre. What's it called? Reset Scenery. That's right, in Glasgow, has become a sort of storage facility for a lot of theatres in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and the southern part of Scotland. Birmingham would be really interesting.
Yeah, especially because we've got a lot of, like, Stephen Knight's opening up the new BBC site in Perth as well. We've got a lot of other... And
you're brilliantly placed in the country.
We are brilliantly
as well.
placed. And again, I was going to ask, how do you find out about these things so that I can start to share, so I can advocate some of those things?
Well, what we've got in the Green Book, if you go into the toolkit section, is whatever information we know about current sharing facilities, which are pretty limited. Mm-hmm. But we need new initiatives, and they can come from anywhere, and they can be very local. If it's university networks, that's a network. Networks is how this is changing. Yeah. If it's networks of immersive practitioners, fantastic, that works.
As we're talking, this morning, both of the discussions that have been in this space have been about accessibility and sustainability. And it seems to me that it's almost a call to action to people in the room. You know, we're all sat here as makers, and I think IEN could help. I really do think we could potentially help facilitate some kind of digital space where people can share and swap.
It can be virtual,
network.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something I would definitely be interested in moving forwards. And I think if people in the room are, please let us know in the feedback so that we can start to mobilise swiftly and arrange and organise some of these things. Because I think it's quite low-hanging fruit that we can do, because I think we're doing it all informally quite well, but it would be nice to be able to make that visible.
To ramp it up.
And to ramp that up.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the cheapest way to do it is software networks that will enable people to search what everybody else has in store. There's a brilliant guy called Craig Fleming who's creating software called Centerline, which I think is going to be free to use or pretty cheap to use. He's based in Glasgow as well, which will enable freelancers, small companies to, you're looking for a grandfather clock, so search to see if somebody in your area has one. It doesn't cost a lot to set up, but it's got to happen. So it does involve everybody starting to give ourselves the tools that will make green working easier.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nashira. This has been really interesting. I think it's been a lot talked about the practical sides of theatre making, but I initially kind of came from the finance sector, and I think there's a bit missing from here. And I'm not sure if it is in the Theatre Green Book or not, but obviously where you're getting funding, where money is being stored is a huge contributor towards carbon emissions. And I wonder if there's any guidance for theatre makers about how to get funding sustainably.
Not really, no. Which doesn't mean I don't think there should be, or that it's not a big issue. Of course, it's a big issue. But we just got lost in the woods of trying to unravel it. It's really, really hard to find clean money. And if you turn off that tap on theatre now, then theatre dies. So it's a journey, and we're not quite sure how to go on it because it's so much wider than theatre. We talk about it quite often, but we haven't found a way to come up with guidance which is clear and realistic and practical and isn't so idealistic at this point where the world is not ideal that we end up just preventing ourselves from making work. So yeah, it's a great question for which I don't have a great answer.
Yeah, there is a website called bank.green, so you can see how green your bank is. So if you're storing money anywhere, you can see how sustainable they are. So if you are holding a large amount of money for a show, be considerate potentially of like where that money is being stored.
I wonder as well that some of the theatre unions have potentially a role to play in starting to unravel this and starting to offer kind of advice. And I think in our sector, we don't have that infrastructure yet. But I think maybe that's the exciting opportunity because we don't have it yet. So if we're going to build that kind of infrastructure, which I suspect will come, then maybe, we have to be doing that sustainably. But I wonder, again, it's going back to some of those big organisations like Bectu, like some of the other unions who have been working in this space, have a much clearer understanding of the complexities of that space, who should be, and we should be maybe putting pressure on them to start to unravel this really challenging space of clean money.
Yeah, and working out how we get from here to there. I remember a conversation with, it was one of the Manchester universities, either the Manchester Metropolitan or University of Manchester, who were doing a talk at GMAST actually at the same time as me, and we were talking about it. And, their legacy funding and partnerships are problematical. And there was a big student revolt about some of the partners. And they were saying, of course we get it. But we also know that if we just instantly cut that off, the damage to the university, to students, to all the things we do, it's like jamming the brakes on a high-speed train. We've got to get work. It's not that we don't need to get there, but we've got to be really thoughtful about how we get there, which isn't just a way of stalling, but it's got to be realistic.
So you're right, it's going to take time to unravel it. All universities, I think, at the moment have significantly problematic partners and revenue sources. And students are aware of it, but we also have a responsibility of duty of care to still provide what we're providing to them. And I think it's going to take time to unravel that. And because it's much more complex than being able to sort of change our everyday practices in terms of making work. It's a great question, and I think starting to have those conversations is what's important as well.
Yeah, and keeping it alive as a subject is important too.
Hi, I just wanted to kind of make a comment based on the earlier question about freelancers and stuff like that. I think as a producer or, we don't always know as much. I mean, I tend to be a bit more hands-on because I kind of worked in all the different departments, but we're not always aware of like what materials are green, what suppliers, we might have preferred suppliers, but we don't necessarily know which suppliers or what materials might be available if we change suppliers, for example. So this is where the freelancers, they're every day working with these materials. They're really interested in the textures, in the material, what they're made of, and this is where their expertise can really feed in. And when they start to have databases of kinds of materials, suppliers that we can take on board and, encourage us to swap our preferred suppliers, for example, this is really, really important to take that knowledge. So try to come with your toolkit, and if you can get your clients to take on board those recommendations and just swap things out, use up your old stock or get rid of it, and start getting new stock in, then it's a really, really big contribution. So yeah, definitely want to encourage that.
So really, really agree. It's everybody's got to be part of this, and we've all got to educate each other.
Oh, I just wanted to speak to the money question, because I think I see a parallel in a lot of industries around this type of question. And I think that looking to institutionalized platforms won't get us there quickly, because the entrenched flows of money that support those institutions you can't pull the brake quickly. But where you can affect change faster is with independent productions that are scrappy and are already, 1 or 2 person shows and, don't really have a budget, maybe even. So there's nobody pulling the strings behind the scenes saying what they can or cannot say. Those are the productions that can say really provocative things that can, and what's interesting is those are the productions that actually can get a lot of attention, because they're saying new things. They're saying things that the established theaters can't say. And some of those productions in the UK, but one of the reasons I was excited to move here from New York last year was that there's a theater to television pipeline in this country, which doesn't exist in the United States. And there are one-woman shows that become major television shows, and 2 creators in particular, Phoebe Waller-Bridges and Michaela Coelho. Those are huge success stories for this country and for this industry. So I think that there is a path forward where if you want to get the money, the dirty money out of theater, you have to make the theater for no money first, which may seem unintuitive, but I think that's the path.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question at the back.
Hi. I event manage across various venues and projects and such. So I've got 2 parts of the question. First of all is, I know that various suppliers will have certifications in various industries, farms, venues, such. Is there a list or a database that you have or could create that has those certifications that could be searched for finding suppliers that have various certifications or ethics or standards?
Yes, I'm sure it's got gaps in it because things have moved quite fast. But for instance, certification systems for timber products, we've got a quite good toolkit page for that, and what they can do and what they can't do. So the answer is yes, we do have pretty good information on that, but we're always looking to expand it wherever anybody sees a gap.
And then the second part would be, is there anything in the pipeline to kind of certify productions?
That's a really, really, really interesting question, partly because one of the things we were talking to the European Commission about on Friday was exactly that. How far do we want to go with a certification system? Whether it's desirable, you get different answers in different parts of Europe. I'd love to say this is a complete generalization, but it turns out to be almost 100% true. In the Nordics, in Holland, in Germany, everybody's really up for certification. France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, absolutely. That's limiting artistic freedom, and they're all valid points of view. It's a really sort of interesting, fun dialogue. Where we've got to at the moment in the UK, there's not huge. We talk about it a lot, but there's not huge appetite. I think where we're sort of all settling is that nobody can afford to, and I'm not sure it will be very desirable anyway, to do a sort of third-party certification system where the ministry comes into the theatre and check that you're not cheating on your records and whatever. Nobody can afford to do that. It costs a huge amount. But equally, it would be very valuable for audiences, who are the other part of this that we haven't talked about, and for freelancers and for everybody else, to know that when a theatre says this is a baseline production, they know what it means and we can all trust it. So we need to end up somewhere in the middle. And I think getting to a point where everybody within our sectors and audiences know what it means. At the moment, you look on different companies' websites and they're very piecemeal. Sometimes you can't even find anything about sustainability. Sometimes there's a sort of slightly piecemeal list of what's been done or hasn't been done. If everybody is working to the same benchmarks and is able to say, we've reached intermediate across our building, our operations and our productions, that really says something. So I think we're sort of heading towards, and it will vary from country to country, towards something which is either very, very informal, but yeah, if organisations want to say this is a Green Book baseline show, that will start more and more to mean something. Or it may be a bit more formal than that, and there is a sort of certification that might be given out by some organisations based on being, a sign-off from the director or CEO or something like that to verify that you really have done it. So it's a live conversation. It's an interesting conversation which has good thinking across all parts of the spectrum. But I think we're moving towards something which is a bit more formal than where we are now, but certainly won't in the short term go all the way to a sort of formal kite mark system.
I think it's interesting because, like you said, it's more and more about the usage. The more and more companies that make it visible that they are baseline or that they're intermediary, it will start to become its own benchmark. But
yes.
I think, again, universities could potentially play a role in that, because we do have lots of accreditations, like with Athena Swan, which is about the way in which equality for women is operating, and EDI across institutions. We have TEF, we have REF.
Be good to learn more about those.
Yeah, because I think universities would be keen to get some kind of accreditation as to where we are on that scale, because we have it in other areas of accessibility.
Well, perhaps we should trial something within universities.
Yeah.
See how it works.
Especially because we have, like, the Russell Group would be potentially a good place to start, because they're already a working group.
And it's a network.
Yeah. And so they could roll that out across there.
That's a really interesting idea.
It's always valuable, isn't it, to be able to, because once you have accreditation, you're accountable.
Yes.
And I think actually that accountability will accelerate.
And will become more and more important. And I don't think there's going to be one answer for all time. I think it may be that we gradually move towards... I know we've got to finish, but can I just say something about audiences?
Yes.
That we've just repeated for the second year a big audience survey into audience attitudes to sustainability, and have a look at it on the website, because it's really fascinating and compelling. I think there were 17,500 audience members responded, and more than 3/4 expect our work to be sustainable. Most of them think that we are already sustainable, which we know is not the case. So we've got some catching up to do. We all, I think, in culture want to be in a sort of leadership role. We can help people, whatever. At the moment, we're behind. And particularly for cultural audiences, and they break this down by age and by other kinds of demographic, there's already a huge burden of expectation on us to change our practice more rapidly. And if that isn't a spur for change, I don't know what it is.
And thank you all so much for coming, and do reach out and do get in touch if you have ideas, if you have resources that you can share. And when the survey comes around, please do highlight any of the things you're thinking of this morning that IEN could do to support, because that's what we are keen to do. That's what we're here to do. And we are a network. And so we might be able to help accelerate and facilitate some of these things moving forward. So please let us know your thoughts about that.